In the city of Ohio, America, during the cold autumn of 1985, a small group of mourners dressed in black stood solemnly around a freshly dug grave in the city cemetery, their faces showing the grief and exhaustion that comes from watching someone die slowly over many months. Among them stood a 5-year-old boy named Jake, his small hand clutched tightly by his mother, Maria, tears streaming down his young face as he watched his father's coffin being lowered into the ground with a finality that his child's mind could not fully comprehend, but his heart understood completely. Jake's father had died of cancer just a few days earlier, after years of battling the disease that had slowly consumed him, transforming the strong man Jake remembered from his earliest memories into a skeletal figure who could barely speak or recognize his own family by the end. The funeral proceeded with prayers and words of comfort from the pastor, but Jake heard none of it through his sobs, understanding only that his father was gone forever and would never again lift him onto his shoulders or tell him bedtime stories or promise that everything would be all right when the world seemed scary. As the mourners stood paying their final respects, dark clouds that had been gathering throughout the ceremony finally opened, and rain began falling steadily, soaking through their funeral clothes and creating small puddles around the gravesite that reflected the gray sky above. The mourners dispersed quickly, seeking shelter in their cars and heading home to dry clothes and warm meals, leaving Maria and Jake standing alone for a few more moments as she tried to compose herself before leading her crying son away from his father's grave. Little did Jake know as he walked away from that cemetery holding his mother's trembling hand that his suffering had only just begun, that this funeral marked not an ending but a terrible beginning of experiences that would shape and twist his young mind in ways that would have profound and horrifying influence on his life and future. The loss of his father would be only the first in a series of traumas that would gradually transform an innocent, grieving child into something dark and dangerous that nobody could have predicted from looking at his tear-stained face on that rainy afternoon. The bullying began almost immediately when Jake returned to kindergarten after his father's funeral, as if the other children could sense his vulnerability and new status as different from those whose families remained intact. On several occasions during recess or lunch breaks, older students would surround him and taunt him cruelly, saying things like, "Where's your daddy, Jake? And you don't have a father anymore because he didn't love you enough to stay alive." These words cut deeper than any physical blow could have, and Jake would cry many times throughout the school day, hiding in bathroom stalls or behind the playground equipment where teachers could not see his tears and ask questions he did not know how to answer. The teachers noticed his changed behavior, the quietness, the reluctance to participate in activities he had once enjoyed, the way he flinched when other children approached too quickly. But they attributed it to normal grief and assured Maria that time would heal his wounds, not understanding that these wounds were being deepened daily by cruelty that went unnoticed because adults rarely see what children do to each other in the moments between supervision. Maria worked long, exhausting hours at a local restaurant where she served food to customers who sometimes tipped well and sometimes left nothing, her income barely enough to cover rent, utilities, food, and the other expenses that seemed to multiply now that she was the family's sole provider. Sometimes she had to work late into the night when the restaurant was busy or when other staff called in sick, and during these times young Jake would be left alone at home with nothing but television and his own frightened thoughts for company in the small apartment that felt too big and empty without his father's presence. He would lie in bed listening to every sound, the neighbors arguing through thin walls, cars passing on the street outside, the buildings settling and creaking, and wonder if his mother would come home safely, or if he would lose her too and be completely alone in a world that had already proven itself cruel and unpredictable. These long, lonely nights, when fear and abandonment mixed with the grief he was too young to process properly, were planting seeds of something dark in Jake's developing mind, creating patterns of thought and feeling that would grow like poisonous plants in soil made fertile by trauma and neglect that no 5-year-old child should have to endure without the support and protection that had died along with his father on that rainy day at the cemetery.
Approximately 1 year after Jake's father had died and been buried in that rainy cemetery, Maria made a decision that she hoped would improve their difficult circumstances and provide stability for herself and her son. She remarried a man named Johnson, a huge man with a massive physical stature that made him intimidating even when he was trying to be friendly, someone she had met through mutual friends who had assured her he was a good man with a steady job who could provide the security and father figure that Jake needed. This remarriage was supposed to be a good thing for both Jake and his mother, a chance to rebuild their broken family and create a new beginning that would erase the pain and struggle of the past year of grief and financial hardship. But instead of bringing the hoped-for stability and happiness, Johnson's entry into their lives marked the beginning of a nightmare for Jake that would last 7 terrible years and fundamentally reshape his psychology in ways that would have devastating consequences, not just for him, but for countless innocent people he would encounter in his future. From almost the first day Johnson moved into their apartment and established himself as the man of the house, he made it clear through his words and actions that he did not view Jake as his son and had no intention of treating the boy with the love and care a child deserves from a parental figure. Johnson would use every opportunity to beat and maltreat Jake, his massive hands delivering blows that left bruises on the boy's arms, back, and legs, strikes that were supposedly punishment for minor infractions like leaving a toy on the floor or speaking too loudly, or simply being present and reminding Johnson that this was not truly his biological child. The beatings were accompanied by cruel words that cut as deeply as the physical abuse. "You're not my real son. Your father was weak and that's why he died. Your mother should have left you at an orphanage instead of making me deal with you." Words that Jake absorbed into his developing sense of self and identity. Maria witnessed some of this abuse but felt trapped by her financial dependence on Johnson and her fear of being alone again. And she convinced herself that discipline was necessary and that Jake was probably exaggerating when he complained about how roughly Johnson treated him when she was at work or otherwise not present to see the full extent of the cruelty being inflicted on her son. This pattern of abuse and maltreatment continued relentlessly for 7 long years, spanning Jake's childhood from age 6 through 13, years that should have been filled with play, learning, and gradual development, but instead were marked by fear, pain, and the slow death of whatever innocence and trust in the world Jake might have retained after his father's death. Each beating taught Jake that the world was cruel and that power meant the right to hurt those weaker than yourself, while each instance of his mother's failure to protect him adequately taught Jake that he could not rely on anyone to save him or care about his suffering. He learned to hide his emotions, to show no reaction when Johnson struck him, because showing pain only seemed to encourage more violence. And he learned to become invisible in his own home, staying in his room for hours and avoiding any interaction that might trigger Johnson's anger or attention. These lessons in survival through emotional shutdown and acceptance of violence as normal would become foundational to Jake's psychology, creating pathways in his brain and patterns in his heart that would eventually express themselves in ways far more terrible than anything Johnson had done to him during those nightmare years. Despite, or perhaps because of, the trauma he endured at home, Jake performed well academically and eventually graduated from high school with grades good enough to gain admission to university, an achievement that should have represented hope and a new beginning, away from the abuse that had defined his adolescence.
When Jake moved into his university dormitory and later into an off-campus apartment, he felt relief at escaping the daily threat of Johnson's violence, but he always felt scared and anxious about returning home for holidays or summer breaks because he knew that beatings were sure to occur whenever he was back in that house where Johnson still lived with his mother. Yet, despite these fears and the deep psychological scars he carried from 7 years of abuse, there was something special about Jake that became apparent to those who met him at university. He was intelligent, with a sharp mind that grasped concepts quickly and excelled in his studies, and he possessed surprisingly good social skills that made it easy for him to interact with people, especially with female students who found him charming and trustworthy in ways that masked completely the darkness growing inside him. This ability to present a friendly, normal facade while hiding the rage and twisted thoughts beneath would serve Jake well as he moved toward the darker part of his life, the part where the abused child would transform fully into something monstrous that would eventually shock an entire city and leave dozens of families grieving losses they would never fully understand or recover from in the years ahead.
At university, Jake discovered that his intelligence and social skills, which had been suppressed and hidden during his years under Johnson's brutal control, could flourish in this new environment where nobody knew about his traumatic past or the violence that had shaped him. He found it surprisingly easy to interact with people, particularly with female students who were drawn to his quiet confidence and the attentive way he listened to their problems and concerns, making them feel valued and understood in ways that their peers often failed to do. Girls would accept his invitations to study together, to grab coffee between classes, or to hang out at his off-campus apartment, never suspecting that behind his friendly smile and seemingly genuine interest in their lives lurked something twisted and dangerous that had been growing in darkness since that rainy day at his father's funeral. Jake's apartment became a place where he exercised complete control, a private space where the powerless boy who had been beaten and degraded for years could finally become the one with power over others, and it was this need for control and domination that would lead him down a path from which there could be no return to normalcy or redemption. The first time Jake acted on the dark urges that had been building inside him for years, he invited a female student named Gloria to his apartment under the pretense of helping her study for an exam they both had coming up in their psychology class. Gloria trusted him because he had always been kind to her in class, and she accepted the glass of soda he offered her without suspicion, not noticing the slight bitter taste that indicated he had crushed sleeping pills into her drink and was waiting for the drug to take effect. When Gloria became drowsy and confused, Jake's friendly demeanor vanished completely, replaced by something cold and predatory as he molested her unconscious body, crossing a line that should have horrified him, but instead filled him with a sense of power and control that felt like revenge against every person who had ever hurt him or made him feel weak and helpless. But even this violation was not enough to satisfy the darkness that had taken root in Jake's psyche during those 7 years of abuse, and as he looked at Gloria's drugged, unconscious form, the worst thought came to his mind, a thought that would transform him from someone who had committed a terrible crime into something far more evil and destructive than anyone who knew him could possibly imagine. Jake strangled Gloria to death with his bare hands, feeling her life slip away beneath his fingers in a way that gave him a rush of power unlike anything he had experienced before, and this feeling was so intense and satisfying that he knew immediately it was something he would need to experience again and again. After she was dead, Jake methodically chopped her body into pieces using knives from his kitchen, packing the remains into black garbage bags with the same calm efficiency he might have used to clean his apartment or complete a homework assignment, his mind detached from the horror of what he was doing through psychological mechanisms that had been formed during years of enduring abuse without being able to fight back or express his rage. That night, Jake carried the bags to his car and drove to a mountain area not far from his apartment where hiking trails wound through dense forest, and he buried Gloria's remains in a location he was certain would never be discovered by casual hikers or anyone else who might wander off the main paths. When he returned home and cleaned the blood from his apartment, Jake felt no remorse or guilt, only satisfaction and anticipation for when he could experience that feeling of absolute power and control again, preferably soon, because the memory of the killing was already fading and he needed to refresh it with new violence. Jake went on to lure more victims using variations of the same basic approach, sometimes inviting them to his apartment and drugging them there, sometimes suggesting outdoor activities like hiking, where he could attack them away from witnesses and cameras that might record his crimes. He tricked one female student to hike with him to a supposedly beautiful viewpoint he had discovered, and when they were alone on an isolated trail, he killed her too, strangling her and then burying her body in the same mountain area where Gloria's remains lay undiscovered. The pattern continued and expanded as Jake's confidence grew and his need for the wush that came from killing intensified. More women, more hiking trips, more careful disposal of bodies in various locations throughout the mountain region where dense vegetation and rugged terrain made discovery unlikely. Suddenly, several missing persons cases became almost daily reports in the city as families desperately searched for daughters, girlfriends, and friends who had simply vanished without trace or explanation, leaving behind only worried loved ones and police departments struggling to find any connection between the disappearances. Despite extensive police investigation that included interviews with hundreds of people and searches of numerous locations, the police could not get any tangible evidence that would lead them to a suspect or even confirm that the missing women had been murdered rather than having run away or met with accidents in unknown locations. Throughout this period of escalating violence and mounting panic in the community, Maria would call Jake sometimes at his apartment to hear his voice and ask how his studies were going, and Jake would chat with his mother as if everything was normal, giving no indication that her son had become a serial killer whose body count was climbing into double digits, while police and families searched desperately for answers that were hiding in plain sight in the form of a charming, intelligent university student that nobody would ever suspect of being capable of such monstrous crimes against innocent young women whose only mistake was trusting someone who seemed safe and friendly.
Several years passed with Jake continuing his horrific pattern of luring and murdering young women while successfully maintaining his facade as a normal, intelligent young man working toward his degree and participating in campus life like any other student. Eventually, Jake graduated from university with honors, an achievement that would have made his late father proud and gave his mother Maria a rare moment of genuine happiness when she attended the ceremony and watched her son receive his diploma, completely unaware that the same hands that accepted that symbol of academic achievement had taken the lives of 30 innocent women whose families would never see them graduate or achieve any of their dreams. After graduation, Jake moved into his own apartment in a different part of the city, got a regular job that provided income and a reason to explain his schedule to anyone who might ask questions, and continued his secret life of hunting for victims whenever the urge became too strong to resist, which happened with increasing frequency as the years passed and the killing became not just a compulsion but the central organizing principle of his entire existence and identity. On what would turn out to be the day that Jake's reign of terror finally ended, he successfully tricked another young woman into agreeing to go hiking with him in the mountain area that had become his personal killing ground over the years. The woman, whose name was Jennifer, had met Jake at a coffee shop where they struck up a conversation that seemed friendly and innocent, and when he suggested they go hiking together the following weekend because he knew some beautiful trails with amazing views, she agreed because he seemed trustworthy and she enjoyed outdoor activities. What Jake did not know, could not have known, because his arrogance and years of getting away with murder had made him careless, was that this particular hiking trip would be his last crime, that the pattern of violence that had defined his adult life was about to be interrupted by chance and the presence of an unexpected witness who would finally bring justice for all the women whose lives he had stolen and whose families had suffered years of not knowing what had happened to their beloved daughters and friends.
When Jake and Jennifer reached a particularly isolated section of the wooded hiking trail, far from the main path where other hikers might pass by and witness what was about to occur, Jake moved behind Jennifer as she paused to admire the view, and he struck her head from the back with a heavy rock he had picked up moments earlier, using enough force to knock her unconscious and make her collapse to the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Jake stood over her fallen body, preparing to strangle her as he had done to so many victims before, his mind already moving ahead to the practical steps of hiding her body and cleaning up any evidence that might connect him to her disappearance. But what Jake did not know, what his narcissism and overconfidence had blinded him to, was that there was another hiker in the mountain that day, a man who had chosen a less popular trail for his morning exercise, and who happened to be positioned where he could see through the trees to the spot where Jake had just attacked Jennifer. This witness immediately understood that he was watching an assault, or possibly an attempted murder, and instead of confronting Jake directly and risking his own life, he pulled out his cell phone and called the police, giving them his exact location and describing what he had just witnessed while keeping Jake in his line of sight to ensure the attacker did not escape before law enforcement arrived. The police showed up within minutes, their sirens wailing through the mountain quiet as multiple patrol cars raced up the access roads and officers ran down the hiking trails toward the location the witness had provided. Jake was caught standing over Jennifer's unconscious but still living body, his hands already reaching for her throat to complete the murder he had planned, and he was immediately tackled to the ground by two officers who handcuffed him and read him his rights, while other officers called for an ambulance to transport Jennifer to the hospital, where she would eventually recover from her head injury and testify about what had happened. At the police station, during hours of interrogation where detectives questioned him about Jennifer's attack and about the numerous missing women cases that had plagued the city for years, Jake surprised investigators by confessing not just to attacking Jennifer, but to murdering 30 women over the course of several years, providing details about some of the killings that only the actual perpetrator could know, and leading police to several burial sites in the mountains where remains were subsequently recovered and identified. When the lead investigator asked Jake the question that haunted everyone involved in the case, "Why did you do this? Why did you kill all these innocent women?" Jake's answer was chilling in its simplicity and complete lack of remorse or understanding of the enormity of his crimes. "It was fun to murder them. It made me feel powerful and in control, and I liked that feeling." Jake was formally arraigned in court, where prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including his detailed confession, physical evidence recovered from burial sites, Jennifer's testimony about her attack, and the testimony from the witness who had seen Jake assault Jennifer and called the police. The court found him guilty of 15 murders based on the cases where physical evidence could definitively link him to specific victims, though investigators and prosecutors believed he was responsible for all 30 killings he confessed to, and possibly even more that he had not admitted or could not remember clearly, given the years of violence and the number of women whose lives he had ended. Some forensic psychologists and criminal profilers who studied Jake's case argued that based on patterns they observed and gaps in his known whereabouts over the years, he might have actually killed hundreds of women rather than the 30 he confessed to, though this speculation could never be proven without additional evidence or further confessions that Jake refused to provide. The judge, after hearing all evidence and victim impact statements from families whose daughters had been murdered by this man who walked among them, appearing normal and trustworthy, sentenced Jake to death by electric chair, a punishment that brought some measure of closure to the families, though it could never undo the damage or bring back the bright futures that were stolen from 30 confirmed victims and possibly many more whose disappearances remained mysteries that would haunt their loved ones forever.
all because a 5-year-old boy who lost his father and then was abused for 7 years had been transformed by trauma and his own choices into a monster who found pleasure in causing the same kind of suffering and loss to others that had been inflicted upon him during those formative years when he learned that the world was cruel and that power meant the right to hurt those weaker than yourself.